All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're diving deep into the world of critical thinking.
Oh, I love this topic.
Me too. And to guide our exploration, we'll be using excerpts from a fascinating book, Critical Thinking, Consider the Verdict.
Oh, I've heard good things about that one.
Yeah, it uses jury deliberations and legal arguments as a framework for understanding how to think clearly and effectively, especially when the stakes are high. Imagine yourself sitting on a jury. It's intense.
Right, someone's fate is in your hands.
Exactly. So how do you sift through all that evidence? How do you avoid letting your biases creep in? And how do you make sure you're thinking straight when so much is riding on your decision?
That's what we're going to unpack today.
Big questions.
Yeah, and the book starts right at the foundation of our legal system, the adversarial process.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's basically a structured debate, right?
Yeah.
Each side presents their strongest arguments, challenges the other's points.
And ultimately, it helps a judge or jury reach a fair decision.
Exactly. But this might seem obvious at first, but think about it. The adversarial process is really a core element of critical thinking itself.
Oh, how so?
Well, it's all about engaging in reasoned debate, considering different viewpoints, questioning assumptions, really getting to the heart of the matter.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
And the book uses this really interesting example of British courts to illustrate this point.
Oh, right.
With their wigs, the bowing, and all that formal language.
It's like something out of a historical oddity.
It does, but it really drives home a vital point.
Absolutely. That tradition, while it might seem a bit quaint, actually emphasizes how important it is to stay respectful, even when you're seriously challenging someone's argument. It reminds us that critical thinking isn't about launching personal attacks, right?
Right. It's about evaluating the arguments themselves.
Exactly.
And that's something we can all apply in our own lives.
For sure, in any kind of disagreement.
Right. How can we disagree strongly without letting it become personal?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a challenge we all face.
It is. But okay, let's move on. There's another important distinction the book makes. The difference between an argument and testimony. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So, picture yourself in that jury box again, listening intently. Right. A witness takes the stand, and they share what they saw or heard. That's testimony, a statement of fact as they experienced it.
Got it.
Now, the lawyers step up, and they present a series of statements that give reasons to support their conclusions. That's an argument.
Okay, so testimony is about what happened.
And
an argument is about why it happened or what it means.
You got it. And here's the crucial part. An argument has to be judged on its own merits, regardless of who's making it.
Oh, that's a good point. The messenger doesn't necessarily invalidate the message.
Exactly. And there's this perfect example in the book. Imagine someone presenting a case for, say, the existence of extraterrestrials.
Okay, I'm listening.
Now, whether you find their argument convincing should depend on the logic and the evidence they present, not on whether you like the person or think they're generally reliable.
Right, you could have a super eccentric UFO enthusiast presenting a very well-reasoned argument.
Exactly. And the book takes it even further with another example. What if you hear someone passionately advocating for, say, vegetarianism, but later you catch them eating a burger?
Uh-oh. Bust.
Right. Does that mean their entire argument for vegetarianism is automatically invalid?
It definitely makes you question their commitment to the cause.
For sure. But it doesn't necessarily invalidate the argument itself.
Yeah.
We have to separate the person from the ideas, evaluate the reasoning, not just judge the individual. It's tough, but it's essential for clear thinking.
That's such an important point. So we've got the adversarial process. We've separated arguments from testimony. Let's add another layer here, burden of proof.
Burden of proof. That's a big one.
It is. What does it mean exactly?
Okay, think about it this way. Say you're checking out reviews for a new phone online. The burden of proof is on the people leaving those glowing 5-star reviews.
Okay, they've got to convince me it's actually as amazing as they claim.
Exactly. They need to provide solid reasons and evidence to support their claims, not just say, trust me, it's the best phone ever.
Otherwise, I'm going to be suspicious.
Rightfully so. Now, in a legal context, the burden of proof usually rests on the person making a claim. They need to provide evidence and reasoning to back up their assertion.
Well, in a trial, the prosecution has the burden of proving the defendant is guilty.
Exactly. And the book uses this really powerful example of jailhouse informants.
Jailhouse informants.
Yeah, these are people who might claim to have heard a suspect confess to a crime when they were both in prison.
Oh, wow. That's tricky.
It is. Because their testimony could be influenced by, say, the promise of a reduced sentence for cooperating.
So how do we know if they're telling the truth?
That's where understanding burden of proof is so important. We have to weigh the evidence carefully, consider potential motives, and ask whether their testimony is truly reliable.
And this concept applies outside the courtroom too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about advertising.
Okay.
Does a company have to prove, beyond a doubt, that their product is completely safe before they can sell it?
That's a good question.
Or are we, the consumers, expected to prove that it's harmful?
Food for thought for sure.
Right. Understanding burden of proof can make us much more critical consumers of information in general.
It's like a lens through which we can examine all kinds of claims.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the adversarial process, arguments versus testimony, and the burden of proof. Now, how about we dive into some tools that can help us think more critically, especially when we're trying to identify those weak or misleading arguments?
Okay, let's get into those tools. The book talks about a bunch of fallacies, common errors in reasoning that can trip us up.
Well, those fallacies, they're everywhere.
I know, right? They're sneaky little things. One of the most common ones is the straw man fallacy.
Oh, the straw man. That's a classic.
It is. It's a tactic used to misrepresent your opponent's argument. Make it easier to attack. It's like setting up a straw man easy to knock down instead of engaging with the real argument.
And if you know about the straw man fallacy, you can call it out when you see it.
Exactly. And the book gives this great example, a case involving energy policy. So this oil company is trying to discredit advocates for renewable energy.
Okay, I see where this is going.
But instead of actually addressing their arguments about, climate change and sustainability,
right,
they twist their position, claiming they want to force everyone back to the dark ages.
Oh, wow. Living without electricity.
Yeah, relying solely on firewood and candles. It's a caricature, right?
A total distortion.
Exactly, a classic straw man. And it allows the oil company to attack this ridiculously easy target instead of engaging with the real issues.
That's so frustrating.
It is. And it happens all the time, all sorts of debates. Like the book also talks about the death panel's distortion during the healthcare reform debates.
Oh, yeah. The idea that doctors would be deciding who lives and who dies.
Exactly. A complete fabrication designed to scare people. The reality was far more complex and nowhere near as scary.
But those kinds of distortions really stick with people.
They do. It's powerful, but it's also incredibly misleading.
It is. All right, so we've got the straw man fallacy. What else should we be watching out for?
Well, another tricky one is the ad hominem fallacy.
That's when you attack the person making the argument instead of the argument itself.
Exactly. It's a distraction tactic.
Yeah.
It's like saying, well, you can't trust anything he says. He's a convicted felon.
Even if what he's saying right now is completely true.
Exactly. Even someone you strongly disagree with, someone who's made mistakes, can still make a valid point. So we have to focus on the substance of the argument, not get sidetracked by judging the individual.
Good advice. So how can we avoid falling into that ad hominem trap? It's so easy to get personal, especially when you feel strongly about something.
Oh, for sure. But the book reminds us to keep our eyes on the argument itself. What's the reasoning? What's the evidence? Is the logic sound? Those are the things that matter.
Not the person's personality or past mistakes.
Exactly. Focus on the ideas, not the individual.
That's a good mantra. Now, are there any other fallacies we should be on high alert for? It feels like there's a whole world of these out there just waiting to trip us up.
Oh, there's so many. But let's touch on a couple more that are pretty common. One is the appeal to ignorance.
Appeal to ignorance.
Yeah. It's where someone claims that something must be true just because it hasn't been proven false.
So basically they're saying, nobody's proven me wrong, so I must be right.
Right. But that's not how proof works. Remember, the burden of proof lies with the person making the claim. It's not enough to just point to a lack of evidence against it.
It's like saying, I believe in Bigfoot because no one has definitively proven that he doesn't exist.
Exactly. You need to present actual evidence for Bigfoot's existence, not just the absence of evidence against it.
Okay, that makes sense. And how about the appeal to popularity?
Ah, yes. The bandwagon fallacy. It's when someone argues that something must be true or good simply because a lot of people believe it.
But popularity doesn't equal truth.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Think about all the fads that have come and gone. Just because something was trendy for a while doesn't mean it was good or right.
Like those low-rise jeans in the early 2000s, everyone was wearing them, but looking back, yikes.
Exactly. Popularity can be misleading. We have to look beyond the hype and think for ourselves.
So true.
And another fallacy that's worth mentioning is the golden mean fallacy.
Golden mean.
Yeah, it's this idea that a moderate position is always the correct one, just because it's in the middle ground. But sometimes a more extreme position might actually be right.
That's a really interesting point. It reminds me of Copernicus.
Oh, right. The whole heliocentric model of the solar system.
Exactly. Back then, everyone thought the Earth was the center of the universe.
It was common sense at the time.
Right. And then Copernicus comes along and says, nope, the Earth actually revolves around the sun.
And he was ridiculed for it.
Because it went against the accepted wisdom of the time. But he was right.
And that's why the golden mean fallacy is so tricky. Sometimes the moderate, safe view is actually wrong.
So we need to be willing to consider all the evidence and arguments, even those that challenge the status quo.
Exactly. We can't just assume that the middle ground is always the right place to be.
So we've covered a lot already. The adversarial process, the difference between arguments and testimony, the importance of burden of proof, and a bunch of those sneaky fallacies.
We've been busy.
But now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about a specific type of argument that I find particularly interesting. The deductive argument by analogy.
Oh, analogies. They can be very powerful.
They can. And the book uses this really thought-provoking one, Judith Jarvis Thomson's violinist analogy. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah. It's a classic. It's often used in discussions about abortion.
Exactly. It's a hypothetical scenario where you wake up and you find yourself connected to a famous violinist.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting.
Right. And this violinist needs to use your kidneys to survive.
Wow, what a situation to wake up to.
I know, right? It's a bit extreme, but it makes you think. The question is, are you morally obligated to stay connected to this violinist, even if it means sacrificing your own freedom and bodily autonomy?
Heavy stuff.
It is. It forces us to consider the rights of the individual versus the right to life. It's a powerful analogy, and it sparks a lot of debate.
And what's great is that the book doesn't just present the analogy, it goes further. It looks at counter-arguments, too.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, and encourages us to engage in that back and forth. Look at the issue from multiple perspectives and really think critically about the implications.
It's like a mental workout.
It is.
And throughout our exploration of critical thinking, consider the verdict, the book doesn't just stick to these abstract concepts. It brings them to life with real-life legal cases.
Oh, for sure. The cases are fascinating.
They are. And they raise important questions about guilt, innocence, intent, the reliability of evidence, all those real-world complexities.
And they challenge us to think like jurors. We have to weigh the evidence, consider the arguments, and try to reach our own conclusions.
Exactly. It's not about being told what to think. It's about learning how to think for yourself.
Right. And that's what critical thinking is all about.
It is. Now, one case that stood out to me was the one about Nathan Jackson.
Nathan Jackson. Remind me.
He was accused of forging a letter of recommendation from his professor.
Oh, right.
He admitted to signing the professor's name, but he claimed that he didn't intend to deceive anyone. He said he had permission to sign other documents for the professor.
So the question is, does intention matter when determining guilt?
Right. If he truly believed he was authorized to sign, was it still forgery? It really makes you think about the nature of criminal intent itself.
It does. It's a very nuanced question.
And then there's the trial of Priscilla Prowler. At first, it seemed like the prosecution had a really strong case.
What was the evidence?
Well, eyewitnesses placed her at the crime scene. They found her fingerprints there, and they even found stolen goods in her car.
Wow. That's a lot.
It is. But then a twist came out during the cross-examination of Priscilla's boyfriend, who was a key witness for the prosecution.
What happened?
It turned out that they'd been having relationship problems, and there was a possibility he might have had a motive to lie.
Oh, so his testimony might not have been reliable.
Exactly. And that raised a whole new set of questions. How much weight should the jury give to his testimony? Could his potential bias have influenced the way the other evidence was interpreted?
That's such a good example of how one piece of information can completely change our perspective on a situation.
It really shows how we can't just consider evidence in isolation. We have to think about the context, the relationships between the people involved, and any potential motives that might be at play.
It's like a puzzle, right? You have to fit all the pieces together, and sometimes a new piece can change the entire picture.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in. It helps us see those connections, those nuances, and ultimately make more informed judgments.
It's a valuable skill, both in the courtroom and in everyday life.
Absolutely, because we're constantly faced with situations where we have to evaluate information, make decisions, and form opinions. And critical thinking considered the verdict provides us with a framework for doing that effectively.
Like a mental toolbox, giving us the tools we need to be more discerning and thoughtful.
Exactly. And while we've been focusing on legal cases, these principles are applicable to so many other areas of life. Whether we're reading a news article, listening to a podcast, or having a conversation with a friend.
Critical thinking skills are essential.
They are.
So what have we learned from our deep dive so far?
Well, we've explored the adversarial process. We've seen the importance of understanding the burden of proof. We've learned to distinguish between arguments and testimony. And we've uncovered a whole bunch of fallacies that can lead us astray.
And we've seen how these principles play out in real-life legal cases. But this is just the beginning, right?
It is.
There's so much more to uncover.
There is. And in part 2 of our deep dive, we're going to continue exploring critical thinking. Consider the verdict. We'll delve even deeper into the complexities of evidence and argumentation.
And we'll continue to build that mental toolbox, giving us the skills we need to think critically and confidently in every aspect of our lives.
So stay tuned. There's much more to come.
Can't wait. Welcome back to our exploration of critical thinking. Consider the verdict.
I'm ready for more.
Great. Let's keep looking at how the book uses legal cases to, really illustrate those critical thinking skills in action.
You know, one that comes to mind, there was this case where a woman, Claudia, was accused of shooting her husband, and the prosecution really emphasized the fact that Claudia was, get this, an expert marksman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were implying that this made her more likely to have committed the crime.
Interesting. But that feels kind of like a red herring, doesn't it?
It did to me, too.
Like, being a skilled shooter doesn't automatically make you a murderer.
Exactly. And thankfully, the defense pointed that out. They argued that her marksmanship skills were totally beside the point. The real question was whether she felt threatened enough to actually use deadly force, in self-defense.
Right. That makes much more sense. It's about motive and context, not just ability.
Totally. It highlights how important it is to separate what's really relevant from those irrelevant details that might just distract us.
Absolutely. We see that all the time, right? Information that seems important but actually leads us away from the real issue.
Oh, yeah, all the time. And that's where those critical thinking skills become so crucial. We need to analyze the information, figure out what truly matters, and not get sidetracked by, emotional appeals or misleading details.
It's like being a detective,
Yeah.
You got to sift through those clues carefully to find the truth.
Love that analogy. Okay, there was another case the book talked about that I found really interesting. A man named Nathan Jackson. He was accused of forging a letter of recommendation from his professor.
Forgery. That's serious.
It is. And he admitted to signing the professor's name, but he claimed it wasn't technically forgery because he had permission to sign other documents for the professor.
Okay, so it hinges on the specifics of the permission he was given.
Right. Did that permission extend to signing a letter of recommendation?
That's a tricky one.
It is. It brings up all these questions about intent and how the law defines a crime.
Right. Like, was it a deliberate act of deception or an honest misunderstanding of the scope of his permission?
Exactly. And it reminds us that we can't always just go by what seems obvious on the surface. We have to dig deeper.
You have to analyze the situation, look at the specific details, and consider all those different perspectives.
Totally. And speaking of digging deeper, the book also explores cases where the jury has to deal with conflicting evidence. Like in the trial of Priscilla Prowler, she was accused of burglary.
Oh, I remember that one. It seemed pretty straightforward at first.
It did. Eyewitnesses placed her at the scene, her fingerprints were found there, and they even found stolen goods in her car.
Wow, that's a lot of evidence pointing to her guilt.
Right. But then, during the cross-examination of Priscilla's boyfriend, who had testified against her, a twist emerged.
What happened?
It came out that they were having some serious relationship issues, and there was a good chance he might have had a reason to lie.
Oh, so his testimony might have been tainted by personal motives.
Exactly. And that really threw a wrench into the whole case.
Because if his testimony wasn't reliable, then the other evidence had to be reevaluated in light of that.
Right. Like maybe the fingerprints were there for an innocent reason, or maybe someone else planted the stolen goods in her car to frame her.
Suddenly, the whole case becomes much more complicated.
Exactly. And it highlights how crucial it is to consider the source of information and any potential biases that might be influencing what's being presented.
We can't just blindly accept evidence at face value. We need to dig deeper, look for those underlying motives, and be open to the possibility that things might not be as they seem.
It's a great example of how new information can completely shift our understanding of a situation. And that's why staying flexible and open to changing our minds is so important.
It is. We can't afford to cling to our initial judgments if the evidence starts pointing in a different direction. We have to be willing to adapt and refine our understanding as we learn more.
Absolutely. So we've seen how critical thinking, consider the verdict, uses those specific legal cases to illustrate critical thinking in action. But let's step back for a second and think about the bigger picture. Why is critical thinking so important, not just in a courtroom, but in our everyday lives?
Well, as we've been discussing, it helps us avoid being misled by fallacies, biases, and those emotional appeals that can cloud our judgment.
It's about thinking clearly, rationally, and objectively.
Exactly. It allows us to analyze information more effectively, make those well-informed decisions, and navigate the world with more confidence. It's like having a mental toolkit, you know?
A toolkit for your mind. I like that.
Yeah. It helps you deconstruct arguments, spot those inconsistencies, and see the weaknesses in reasoning.
And those tools are useful in any situation where we have to make judgments or evaluate information, right?
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't matter if you're reading a news article, listening to a political debate, or even just having a conversation with a friend. Critical thinking helps us cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter.
It's about becoming more aware of our own thought processes, questioning those assumptions that we often take for granted, and being open to different perspectives.
It's a journey, you know?
Yeah.
A lifelong process of learning and refining these skills.
And the book also talks about understanding the structure of arguments, right?
Oh, yeah. That's key.
It's not just about the individual reasons someone gives, but how those reasons are connected and how they support the overall conclusion.
Right. It's like building a house. You need a solid foundation and strong supports to hold it all up.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. One common argument structure is what's called a convergent argument. It's where several independent reasons are given to support a conclusion. Imagine it like several pillars holding up a roof. Even if one pillar is weak or damaged, the roof might not collapse. The other pillars might be strong enough to hold it up.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So it's like having multiple lines of reasoning backing up a point.
Exactly. And the book uses the example of Priscilla Prowler's trial to illustrate this. Remember, the prosecution presented several pieces of evidence against her. The eyewitness accounts, the fingerprints, the stolen goods. Each of those pieces of evidence provided some support for the conclusion that she was guilty. But when those doubts were raised about the boyfriend's testimony, it weakened one of those supporting pillars. However, it didn't automatically mean the whole case fell apart.
So the jury had to decide whether the remaining evidence was still strong enough to support a guilty verdict. It's a really good illustration of how we can analyze the strength of an argument by looking at how the different reasons work together.
Right. We have to evaluate those individual pieces of evidence and see how they fit into the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And that's a core part of critical thinking.
Absolutely. And as critical thinking, consider the verdict, emphasizes, these skills are just as important outside the courtroom as they are inside it.
Oh, for sure. They're essential for navigating all the complexities of everyday life, from personal relationships to professional decisions.
You know, there's one area where I think critical thinking is especially crucial. When we're dealing with claims that rely on expert authority.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
It's easy to just accept what experts say, especially if they have impressive credentials. But the book cautions us to be a bit more discerning.
Yeah, it's tempting to just think, well, they're the expert, so they must be right.
Right. But just because someone is an expert in one area doesn't make them an authority on everything. Even the best experts can have biases, you know.
Mm-hmm.
They can make mistakes or be influenced by things we might not be aware of.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. The book talks about this group, the American Council on Science and Health. They present themselves as this independent group of scientists.
Okay, sounds legit.
Right. But then, if you dig a little deeper, you find out they're actually funded by industries that have a vested interest in the outcomes of their research, like the chemical industry, for example, or the food processing industry.
Ah, so there's a potential conflict of interest there.
Exactly. So naturally, we might want to be a bit more skeptical of their claims about, say, the safety of certain chemicals or the nutritional value of processed foods.
It's a good reminder to always consider the source of information and to be aware of those potential biases.
Absolutely. We should always be asking questions like, who's funding the research? What are their motivations? Are there other experts who disagree with their findings? Asking those questions can help us be much more critical consumers of information.
And that applies to more than just scientific research, right?
Oh, for sure. It applies to any situation where experts are weighing in. financial advisors, political commentators, doctors. They all have expertise in their fields, but we have to remember they're human. Their opinions can be shaped by all sorts of factors.
So how can we evaluate expert testimony with a more critical eye? What are some key questions we should be asking?
Well, the book offers some great guidance here. First, consider whether the person is actually an expert in the relevant field. Just because someone has a PhD doesn't mean they're qualified to speak on every topic.
Right. Expertise in one area doesn't necessarily translate to others.
Exactly. Then look at whether there's general agreement among experts in that field, or if there's a lot of debate and conflicting opinions. If there's a lot of disagreement, it might be a sign that more research is needed, or that the issue is more complex than it appears.
That makes sense. It's like getting a second opinion from a doctor.
Right. And perhaps most importantly, ask yourself, is this expert likely to be objective and impartial? Or do they have a dog in the fight, so to speak? Do they have a vested interest in a particular outcome? Understanding those nuances can make us much more discerning when we're evaluating information, especially when it's coming from someone claiming expert authority.
It's about thinking for ourselves. Even when we're dealing with complex topics or relying on information from experts, we can't just passively absorb information. We have to actively engage with it, question it, and make our own judgments based on the evidence.
You got it. It's all about being an active participant in the process of understanding the world around us. And critical thinking, consider the verdict, is a great guide for developing those skills.
It really is. It's like they say, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. This book is teaching us how to think, not just what to think.
I love that. And there's still so much more to learn.
There is. And that's what we'll be doing in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll be looking at even more fascinating legal cases, those different layers of reasoning, and how they all connect.
We'll continue bridging that gap between the courtroom and everyday life, showing how these critical thinking principles can help us be more informed, more confident, and more in control of the decisions we make every single day.
I can't wait. It's going to be fascinating. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into critical thinking. Consider the verdict. We've been covering so much ground already, but there's one more argument type I want to dissect before we wrap up. You know, the slippery slope argument?
Oh, yeah, the slippery slope. It's like that classic saying, if you give a mouse a cookie.
Exactly. It can get out of hand quickly, right?
It can. But in terms of arguments, it's when someone claims that taking one action will inevitably lead to this whole chain of increasingly negative consequences, even if there's like no real evidence to support that chain of events.
I see what you mean. It's like saying if we ban plastic straws, the next thing you know, the government will be controlling everything we eat and drink.
Right. It's a slippery slope from straws to like total government control. Not very convincing.
Not really, but the book makes a good point about the difference between, you know, legitimate cautionary arguments and those slippery slope fallacies.
Oh, totally. Like, it's not wrong to point out the potential downsides of something.
Right.
As long as you can back it up.
Right. Give me some solid reasons and evidence.
Exactly. Like, if you're arguing against, say, offshore oil drilling because of the risk of spills and environmental damage, that's a legitimate concern.
Right. There's a lot of evidence to support that worry.
There is. But if you're arguing against, I don't know, letting kids have cell phones because you think it'll lead to them becoming mindless zombies glued to their screens 24/7.
Well, that's a bit of a stretch.
It is. It's a slippery slope without any real evidence to connect those dots.
So how can we spot those slippery slope fallacies when we hear them? Because they can be pretty persuasive sometimes, especially when they play on our fears.
Oh, absolutely. The book is this really helpful tip. Look for claims that are like super vague or lack evidence.
Okay, so watch out for those generalizations and fear-mongering.
Exactly. Ask yourself, is there a clear logical connection between the initial action and the predicted consequences? Or is it just trying to scare you without any real substance?
That's a good reminder. Okay, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about dilemmas. Another argumentative structure that can be a bit tricky.
Dilemmas, those are fun. It's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right. You're presented with this limited set of choices, often framed as an either situation.
And the challenge is figuring out if it's a real dilemma, where those are truly the only options, or a false dilemma, where other possibilities have been, conveniently left out.
The book uses this example of a judge instructing a jury, right? They have to decide if the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt or not guilty.
Right. And in that specific legal context, those are the only two options.
Exactly. It's a genuine dilemma.
But sometimes arguments present dilemmas that aren't so clear-cut.
Like a false choice.
Exactly. Like someone might say, we either have to increase military spending or risk becoming vulnerable to our enemies.
Okay, but is that really the only choice?
Maybe not. There might be other ways to strengthen national security without drastically increasing military spending. It's a false dilemma because it ignores those other possibilities.
So the key is to be aware of those false dilemmas and to challenge arguments that try to box us in.
Exactly. We always have to ask if there are other options, other perspectives that haven't been considered. It's about expanding our thinking beyond those limited choices.
That's so important. Okay, as we wrap up our deep dive into critical thinking, consider the verdict. I have to say, one thing that really struck me about this book is how it encourages you to think for yourself.
It does, doesn't it?
It lays out the cases, presents the arguments, shows the evidence, but it never tells you what to believe. It's all about giving you the tools and the framework to reach your own conclusions.
I agree. And that's what makes it such a powerful tool for developing those critical thinking skills. It's not about memorizing a bunch of facts or blindly accepting someone else's opinion. It's about learning how to analyze information, recognize biases, and make those well-reasoned judgments.
It's about taking ownership of your own thinking.
Exactly.
And those skills are invaluable, not just in a classroom setting, but in every aspect of life.
Oh, absolutely. It's about navigating relationships, making smart choices at work, being an informed citizen. Critical thinking helps us make sense of the world around us.
Especially in this day and age. I mean, we're bombarded with information from all sides, news, social media, advertising. It's overwhelming.
It is. And if we don't have those critical thinking skills, it's easy to get swept away by the tide, to just accept whatever we see or hear without really questioning it.
And that's how misinformation spreads, how biases get reinforced, how we end up making decisions that aren't really in our best interests.
It's scary how easily it can happen if we're not paying attention.
So as we wrap up our exploration of critical thinking, consider the verdict, what are some of the key takeaways we can all carry with us?
Well, we've learned about the adversarial process, how important that burden of proof is, and how to tell the difference between an argument and just someone's testimony. We've also dug into all those common fallacies, those sneaky little tricks that can lead us astray.
We've really gotten a good look at how those principles play out in those real-life legal cases, which is fascinating. And we've started to think about how we can apply all of this to our own lives. Right?
Yes, Philly. We've learned about how arguments are structured, the importance of really evaluating evidence, and how tricky it can be to assess those expert opinions.
But I think, most importantly, we've started to cultivate that habit of questioning our own assumptions, being open to different viewpoints, and making judgments based on reason and evidence, not just on what feels right in the moment or what everyone else seems to be doing.
It's about becoming more aware, more engaged, and more empowered to think for ourselves.
Exactly. So the next time you're reading a news article or listening to a podcast, or even just having a conversation with a friend or family member, think about the lessons we've learned from critical thinking. Consider the verdict.
Ask those tough questions. What are the arguments? What's the evidence? Are there any biases at play? And what do I think about this and why?
It's about going beyond just passively consuming information and becoming an active participant in the process of understanding the world around us.
Yes. And critical thinking, consider the verdict, gives us the tools to do just that.
Well said. And that brings our deep dive to a close. We hope you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating topic with us. Remember, critical thinking isn't just a skill, it's a way of approaching life. It's about being curious, being skeptical, and always seeking the truth. So keep those minds sharp, keep asking those questions, and never stop learning. Thanks for joining us.